You gotta be kidding me. This whole thing's a joke.
For the calculated execution of your entire family for financial gain, you are hereby sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
At 12:15 p.m. on June 15, 2022, in a sprawling waterfront mansion in Miami, Florida, 18-year-old Nicholas Davis raised a gun and shot his father, Marshall, in the chest and head, then systematically executed his mother, Helen, and his 2 younger sisters, Emma and Sophie, ending 4 lives in 32 minutes of cold-blooded brutality. The billionaire's son believed he had committed the perfect crime, staging the scene to look like a home invasion and creating an alibi that placed him miles away at his country club. What Nicholas didn't know was that his father's state-of-the-art smart home security system had captured everything. The audio of the murders, his voice as he killed his begging family members, and the digital fingerprint of his iPhone remotely reactivating the system at the exact moment he pulled the trigger. When the housekeeper discovered the bodies at 6:30 p.m. that evening, Nicholas was already performing grief for the cameras, but the technology his father had created would soon expose the truth. This wasn't a random home invasion. It was a son murdering his entire family to inherit $50 million after his parents cut off his allowance due to his gambling addiction and drug use. The 2 Davis daughters, 16-year-old Emma and 14-year-old Sophie, had been found in their rooms, each killed with clinical precision that spoke to a perpetrator who had methodically moved through the house, executing a plan. The crime scene bore all the hallmarks of what investigators initially believed might be a home invasion gone wrong. Drawers pulled open, valuables scattered, windows broken, but experienced detectives immediately noted inconsistencies that didn't align with a robbery. Detective Samuel Torres, a 15-year veteran of the Miami Police Department's Homicide Division who had worked hundreds of murder cases, stood in the marble-floored foyer and felt his instincts screaming that something about this scene was staged, that the chaos was too perfect, too deliberate, in its attempt to appear random. The family's elaborate smart home security system, which Marshall Davis had personally designed using cutting-edge technology from his own company, had been completely disabled, with no footage available from any of the dozens of cameras that normally recorded every angle of the property. As news of the massacre spread through Miami's elite circles, one family member emerged as the focus of both media attention and investigative scrutiny. 18-year-old Nicholas Davis, the only surviving member of the household, who had allegedly been at tennis practice at his exclusive country club when his entire family was slaughtered. Nicholas appeared at the crime scene at 7:15 p.m., having been notified by police after the housekeeper's 911 call, and his performance of grief was so compelling, so visceral in its apparent authenticity, that even hardened detectives found themselves momentarily swayed by his tears and trembling hands. He told investigators he had left the house at 11:30 a.m. for his standing tennis lesson and lunch at the club, providing what seemed like a straightforward alibi that could be easily verified through club records and witness statements. Before we continue with this devastating story, I want to ask you to subscribe to stay updated on cases like this, and please share in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us understand our community. Nicholas's initial interviews painted a picture of a loving son devastated by an unimaginable tragedy, a young man who spoke eloquently about his father's brilliance, his mother's kindness, and his sister's bright futures that had been stolen by senseless violence. He described his last morning with his family in heartbreaking detail: breakfast with his mother, a brief conversation with his father about his upcoming semester at Yale University, silly jokes with his sisters before he headed to the club. The media quickly embraced the narrative of the grieving heir, and within 24 hours, Nicholas's tearful press conference outside the family estate had been viewed millions of times, with the public expressing overwhelming sympathy for the young man who had lost everything. But Detective Torres watched those same interviews with growing suspicion, noting subtle inconsistencies in Nicholas's body language. The way his grief seemed to intensify when cameras were present, but diminished in private moments, and most tellingly, his oddly specific recollections of mundane details while claiming to remember nothing unusual that might have suggested danger. The Miami Police Department's Digital Forensics Unit, led by specialist Carmen Rodriguez, began the painstaking process of examining the family's disabled security system, working to understand how such a sophisticated network could have been completely shut down without leaving any trace. The system, which Marshall Davis had installed just 6 months earlier as a prototype for a product his company planned to commercialize, included not just cameras, but audio recording capabilities in every room, motion sensors, and automated cloud backup systems that were designed to be virtually impossible to completely erase. Rodriguez's team discovered that the system had been manually disabled on June 14th at 8:47 p.m., just hours before the murders, using Marshall Davis's administrative credentials from a terminal in his home office. What struck Rodriguez as immediately suspicious was the thoroughness of the shutdown. Whoever had disabled the system had known exactly which protocols to follow, which backups to target, and which redundancies to eliminate, suggesting intimate knowledge of the technology that only someone with extensive access and training would possess. As the first 48 hours of the investigation unfolded, Nicholas Davis maintained his public persona of the devastated survivor, even as Detective Torres's team began quietly verifying every element of his alibi. The country club confirmed that Nicholas had a standing tennis lesson scheduled for 12 p.m. on June 15th, and the club's entry logs showed his membership card being scanned at 11:43 a.m. However, when Torres personally interviewed the tennis pro who was supposed to give Nicholas his lesson, the coach revealed that Nicholas had canceled via text message at 11:30 a.m., claiming a family emergency, and had never actually appeared for the session. The club's valet staff, when pressed, acknowledged that while Nicholas's car had been parked in the lot, no one could specifically remember seeing Nicholas himself between his arrival and his departure at approximately 5:15 p.m., when he had rushed out, claiming he needed to get home. The timeline was beginning to crack, but Detective Torres needed more than inconsistencies. He needed evidence that would definitively place Nicholas at the scene during the time of the murders. The medical examiner's preliminary report estimated the time of death for all 4 victims between 12:01 p.m. and 1:01 p.m. on June 15th, based on body temperature, rigor mortis, and stomach contents. This narrow window created a critical problem for Nicholas's alibi because even if he had been at the club as claimed, the drive from the club to the Davis estate was only 12 minutes, meaning he could theoretically have made the trip during a window when no one could specifically account for his whereabouts. Torres knew that in cases involving wealthy defendants with access to elite legal representation, circumstantial evidence and timeline discrepancies would not be enough. He needed something irrefutable, something that would survive the scrutiny of the best defense attorney's money could buy. The break in the case came not from traditional detective work, but from the very technology that Marshall Davis had spent his career developing. Carmen Rodriguez and her forensics team, working around the clock in their climate-controlled laboratory in downtown Miami, made a discovery that would ultimately seal Nicholas Davis's fate and expose the horrifying premeditation behind the murders. While examining the cloud infrastructure that supported the Davis family's smart home system, Rodriguez found something that the killer had not known existed: a secondary backup protocol that Marshall Davis had implemented as a failsafe, one that operated independently of the primary system and stored encrypted audio files on a separate server that could only be accessed with specialized credentials. The system had been designed to protect against exactly the kind of catastrophic failure or malicious tampering that had occurred, and it had continued recording even after the primary system was disabled. What Rodriguez discovered in those backup files would haunt her for the rest of her career. The audio recordings from June 15, 2022, beginning at 11:52 a.m. and continuing until 12:47 p.m., captured in chilling detail the sounds of the Davis family's final moments. Marshall Davis's voice could be heard in his office, apparently on a phone call discussing a business matter, when the first gunshot rang out at 12:15 p.m. Helen Davis's screams echoed from the kitchen, followed by the desperate pleas of the two daughters, their young voices crying out for mercy that would never come. Most damning of all, the recordings captured another voice, a male voice that Rodriguez immediately recognized from the dozens of media interviews she had watched. The voice of Nicholas Davis, cold and methodical, moving through the house with calculated precision. The audio evidence was devastating in its clarity and its implications. Nicholas could be heard speaking to his family members before he killed them, his tone devoid of the emotion he would later display for cameras, his words revealing a chilling rationale for what he was about to do. The recordings captured him telling his father that this was what had to happen when Marshall had taken everything away, referring to the canceled allowance that Nicholas viewed as theft rather than parental discipline. Helen's final words were pleas for her daughters' lives, begging Nicholas to spare his sisters even if he felt he needed to kill his parents, but the audio captured his cold refusal and the shots that followed. The forensics team would later determine that the entire massacre had taken approximately 32 minutes from first shot to last, with Nicholas moving systematically from room to room, and that he had spent several minutes after the killings attempting to stage the scene to look like a robbery. But the most incriminating evidence came from a discovery that Detective Torres made when examining Nicholas's iPhone, which had been voluntarily surrendered during the initial investigation when Nicholas was still playing the role of cooperative victim. The phone's activity logs revealed that at exactly 12:15 p.m. on June 15th, the exact moment when the first gunshot was recorded on the backup audio files, Nicholas's iPhone had sent a remote command to the Davis family's smart home security system. The command had come from an administrative app that Marshall Davis had installed on Nicholas's phone months earlier, giving his son the ability to control certain aspects of the home's technology. What Nicholas had not known was that the app logged every command with timestamp and GPS coordinates, creating an irrefutable digital record of his actions. The GPS data embedded in that 12:15 p.m. command showed that Nicholas's iPhone had been inside the Davis family estate, not at the country club 12 minutes away. Further examination revealed that Nicholas had sent the command to reactivate the security system's primary functions, apparently believing that by turning it back on after the murders, he could create a record suggesting the system had been functioning normally and had simply failed to capture any useful footage. What he had not understood was that reactivating the system created a log entry showing when it had been turned off, when it had been turned back on, and most crucially, from what device and location those commands had originated. His attempt to cover his tracks had instead created a perfect digital fingerprint, an irrefutable piece of evidence that placed him at the scene at the exact moment of the first murder, operating the very security system he later claimed had been disabled by unknown intruders. Detective Samuel Torres assembled his investigative team in a secure conference room at Miami Police Department headquarters on the morning of June 18, 2022, knowing that the evidence they had gathered in just 72 hours had transformed this from a potential home invasion into a case of calculated familicide. The detective spread out printouts of the iPhone activity logs, transcripts of the recovered audio files, and timeline analyses across the conference table walking his team through what he now understood to be an elaborate murder plot that had only failed because the killer had underestimated his father's technological safeguards. Torres, who had built his reputation on methodical, evidence-driven investigations, felt both satisfaction at the strength of the case and profound sadness at the depravity it revealed. An 18-year-old who had slaughtered his entire family over money then performed grief for the cameras with the skill of a trained actor. The team's immediate challenge was determining how to approach Nicholas Davis now that they had evidence contradicting his alibi, weighing the tactical advantages of confronting him directly against the risk of alerting him to the investigation's direction and potentially triggering flight. Carmen Rodriguez from the Digital Forensics Unit presented her team's full analysis of the smart home system, using detailed technical diagrams to explain how the backup protocols had survived Nicholas's attempts to wipe the system. She explained that Marshall Davis, perhaps with an engineer's paranoia about data loss, had implemented what he called a digital black box, a system that operated on the assumption that the primary security network might be compromised and therefore needed an independent failsafe that could not be accessed or disabled through normal administrative channels. The backup system had been configured to automatically upload encrypted audio files to a cloud server every 60 seconds, with files only accessible through a master key that Marshall had stored in a secure digital vault with his attorney. Rodriguez's team had obtained that key through a court order served on Marshall's law firm, and what they found in those encrypted files had provided not just audio evidence of the murders, but a complete timeline of Nicholas's movements through the house, including periods where he appeared to be staging the scene and searching for valuables to take in order to support the robbery narrative. The investigative team's timeline now showed a methodical plan that Nicholas had apparently been developing for weeks, if not months. The audio recordings began with Nicholas returning to the house at 11:52 a.m., entering through the garage door that connected to the kitchen where his mother was preparing lunch. Helen Davis could be heard greeting her son with surprise, asking why he had come home early, and Nicholas responding with a casual lie about his tennis lesson being canceled due to his instructor's illness. For the next 23 minutes, the audio captured seemingly normal household sounds. Helen cooking, Nicholas moving through the house, his father on a business call in his office, creating a haunting soundtrack of a family's final moments of normalcy before violence shattered everything. At 12:14 p.m., Nicholas could be heard entering his father's office, and Marshall's voice reflected pleasure at seeing his son, asking him to wait just a moment while he finished his call, completely unaware that he had less than 60 seconds to live. The audio from 12:15 p.m. onward would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, though Detective Torres knew the recordings would be as devastating to listen to in court as they had been in the forensics lab. Marshall Davis's business call had ended, and the recording captured what sounded like the beginning of a father-son conversation before Nicholas's tone shifted to something colder, more accusatory, mentioning the cut allowance and demanding that his father fix this now. Marshall's response, calm but firm, explained that the allowance had been suspended because Nicholas needed to address his gambling and drug problems before he could be trusted with money again, that this was not punishment but an intervention driven by love and concern. Nicholas's reply, chilling in its entitled rage, declared that his father had no right to control money that would eventually be Nicholas's anyway, and that if Marshall wouldn't restore the allowance, Nicholas would find another way to get what I'm owed. The sound of the first gunshot came 7 seconds later, followed by Marshall Davis's body hitting the floor of his home office. Helen Davis must have heard the gunshot from the kitchen because the audio captured her running toward her husband's office, calling out his name in rising panic. What followed was perhaps the most heartbreaking element of the entire recording. Helen's realization that her son was holding a gun, her desperate attempts to understand what was happening, and her shift from confusion to maternal protection as she understood that Nicholas intended to kill the entire family. She could be heard begging Nicholas to explain what he was doing, offering to give him money, to help him with whatever problems he was facing, promising that they could work together to fix whatever had driven him to this point. Nicholas's response, captured with horrific clarity, revealed the twisted logic that had brought him to this moment. You took everything from me, so I'm taking everything from you, and then I'm taking what should have been mine all along. The second and third gunshots that killed Helen Davis came at 12:19 p.m., followed by the sound of Nicholas's footsteps as he moved toward the stairs leading to his sister's rooms. Emma and Sophie Davis, 16 and 14 respectively, had apparently been in Emma's bedroom listening to music when the gunshots rang out, and the audio captured their confused conversation about the sounds, debating whether they should go downstairs to check. By the time they decided to investigate, Nicholas was already climbing the stairs, and the recordings captured Emma opening her bedroom door and freezing when she saw her brother approaching with a gun. What followed was a desperate negotiation for survival, with Emma trying to use their sibling bond to reach whatever humanity might remain in Nicholas, reminding him of shared childhood memories, of times he had protected them, of the family they had been before money and addiction had poisoned everything. Sophie's voice, younger and more frightened, could be heard crying in the background, pleading with Nicholas not to hurt them, promising to keep secrets if he would just let them live. Nicholas's responses, cold and final, made clear that he had already decided there could be no witnesses, that his plan only worked if the entire family was dead, and the scene could be staged as a random home invasion. The audio recordings captured the moment at 12:28 p.m. when Nicholas shot Emma Davis, followed by Sophie's screams and her desperate attempt to run, the sound of a brief chase through the upstairs hallway, and the final gunshots that ended the life of the youngest Davis family member at 12:31 p.m. What came after was perhaps even more disturbing than the murders themselves. 16 minutes of audio in which Nicholas could be heard methodically moving through the house, opening drawers and tossing items to create the appearance of a robbery, breaking windows from the inside, and even pausing at one point to apparently search online on his phone. His voice muttering about staging home invasions and what valuables to take. The recordings captured him collecting jewelry, cash, and small electronics, placing them in what sounded like a bag, and then apparently disposing of them somewhere off the property, creating the impression that robbers had fled with stolen goods. At 12:47 p.m., the audio captured Nicholas leaving the house through the garage and the sound of his car starting and driving away back toward the country club where he would complete his alibi by appearing to have spent the entire afternoon. Detective Torres knew that the audio evidence alone would be compelling, but the iPhone data provided the technological corroboration that would make the case virtually unassailable. The phone's GPS log showed Nicholas's device traveling from the Davis estate at 11:47 a.m., arriving at the country club at 11:58 a.m., remaining stationary in the parking lot for approximately 15 minutes, and then traveling back to the estate at 12:07 p.m., arriving at 12:19 p.m. The timeline perfectly matched the audio recordings and completely contradicted Nicholas's claim that he had been at the club during the murders. Even more damning was the discovery that Nicholas had used his iPhone at 12:31 p.m. to search for how long until time of death can be determined, and at 12:39 p.m. to search how to create alibi after the fact, searches that demonstrated both his consciousness of guilt and his desperate attempts to ensure his plan would work. The phone also revealed that at 12:15 p.m., the exact moment of the first gunshot, Nicholas had used the smart home app to remotely reactivate the security system, apparently believing this would create a record of the system functioning normally throughout the day. What Nicholas had failed to understand was that smart home systems don't just record when they're turned on, they also log every command, every change in status, and every access attempt, all time-stamped and GPS tagged with military precision. The reactivation command from 12:15 p.m. proved not only that Nicholas had been at the house during the murders, but that he had been actively manipulating the security system in an attempt to cover his tracks, turning what might have been explained as a tragic coincidence of timing into irrefutable evidence of premeditation and attempted concealment. The logs also showed that Nicholas had sent a deactivation command at 8:47 p.m. the previous evening, using his father's credentials that he had apparently obtained by watching Marshall enter his password, demonstrating that the murder plan had been set in motion at least 15 hours before the actual killings. The digital evidence created a complete picture of a calculated, premeditated massacre, with every element of Nicholas's plan captured and preserved by the very technology his father had created. On June 19, 2022, Detective Torres made the decision to bring Nicholas Davis in for a formal interview, carefully structuring the approach to avoid alerting the 18-year-old to the full extent of the evidence against him. Nicholas arrived at the police station with his attorney, a high-priced Miami criminal defense lawyer named Robert Kensington, who specialized in representing wealthy clients and who had been retained by the Davis family estate's trustees to protect Nicholas's legal interests. Torres conducted the interview with practiced patience, allowing Nicholas to repeat his alibi in detail, to describe his grief over his family's deaths, and to speculate about who might have committed such a horrific crime. The detective noticed how Nicholas's performance had evolved since the initial interviews at the crime scene. His grief was more controlled now, less raw, as if he had been practicing and refining his emotional presentation based on public reaction to his earlier appearances. Torres waited until Nicholas had fully committed to his timeline before introducing the first piece of contradictory evidence, the statement from the tennis instructor confirming that Nicholas had canceled his lesson and never appeared for it. Nicholas's reaction was telling, a brief flash of panic in his eyes before his expression settled into confusion and his explanation that he had been at the club, but perhaps in the cafe or on the grounds rather than at his lesson. When Torres pressed him about why he had lied initially about having the lesson, Nicholas claimed he had been so traumatized that he had confused his schedule, that he had intended to have the lesson and, in his grief-stricken state, had remembered it as actually happening. Attorney Kensington interjected at that point, noting that his client was still in shock and that minor inconsistencies in his recollection were to be expected given the circumstances. The detective then shifted to the security system, asking Nicholas to explain his understanding of how it worked and whether he had known about the backup protocols his father had implemented. Nicholas's answer demonstrated both his arrogance and his ignorance. He confidently explained that he knew the system well because his father had taught him to use the administrative controls, and that he was certain the backup systems had all been disabled, along with the primary network, because that was how these things work. Torres watched Nicholas dig himself deeper, explaining in detail his knowledge of the system's capabilities and his understanding that once disabled, it would retain no data, all while apparently not realizing that this knowledge would later be used to demonstrate his capability and motive for disabling the system before the murders. Kensington again tried to redirect the conversation, sensing that his client was providing too much information, but Nicholas seemed unable to resist demonstrating his technical knowledge, perhaps trying to subtly suggest that if he knew how to truly disable the system, it would have stayed disabled. Detective Torres ended the interview without revealing the full extent of the evidence, thanking Nicholas for his cooperation and expressing sympathy for his loss, all while knowing that the digital net was tightening around the young killer with every passing hour. The investigative team had made the tactical decision to continue gathering evidence before making an arrest, wanting to ensure they had documented every piece of Nicholas's plot before he had an opportunity to destroy additional evidence or flee. Carmen Rodriguez and her forensics team had now expanded their examination to Nicholas's personal computer, his iPad, and his email accounts, searching for any evidence of planning, research, or motive that would further strengthen the case. What they were about to discover would exceed even Detective Torres's darkest expectations about the level of premeditation that had gone into the Davis family massacre. On the morning of June 21, 2022, Carmen Rodriguez sat in her forensics laboratory in downtown Miami, staring at computer screens that displayed the search history from Nicholas Davis's personal laptop, feeling a combination of professional satisfaction and deep moral revulsion. The laptop, which had been seized with a search warrant executed on Nicholas's apartment near the University of Miami campus, contained a detailed digital roadmap of the murder plot, a chronicle of research and planning that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the massacre had been meticulously premeditated rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Rodriguez had spent her career analyzing digital evidence, but she had never encountered a case where the perpetrator had so thoroughly documented his own criminal intent, apparently operating under the assumption that he would never be caught and that his laptop would remain a private repository of his darkest thoughts. The search history began 3 weeks before the murders on May 24, 2022, the same day that Marshall and Helen Davis had confronted their son about his gambling debts and drug use and announced the suspension of his allowance pending his entry into a treatment program. The first searches were relatively innocuous, focused on legal questions about trust fund inheritance and whether parents could legally control adult children's access to family money. Nicholas had apparently spent hours researching the structure of his trust fund, learning that while the principal was locked until he turned 25, his parents had retained discretionary control over distributions and could technically reduce or eliminate his access entirely if they documented a pattern of irresponsible behavior. Searches from May 25th showed Nicholas exploring whether he could challenge his parents' decision in court, whether he could claim financial abuse, and whether he could petition for early access to the trust based on emancipation or other legal theories. The search history painted a picture of an entitled young man grappling with the sudden loss of the lavish lifestyle he had taken for granted, someone whose first instinct was not to address the addiction and gambling problems that had prompted the intervention, but to find legal or procedural workarounds to restore his access to money. But the searches took a darker turn on May 27, 2022, when Nicholas apparently concluded that legal avenues would not restore his allowance quickly enough to address his mounting debts. Rodriguez documented a series of searches on that date that showed Nicholas exploring accelerated inheritance scenarios, searching for what happens to trust fund if parents die, and immediate distribution upon death of parents. The search history showed him visiting multiple estate planning websites, reading articles about how inheritance worked when parents died without updating their wills, and specifically researching whether trust funds automatically distributed to beneficiaries upon the death of the trustees. Over the following days, the searches became more specific and more chilling. How to access trust fund immediately. Emergency inheritance distribution. Can you inherit early if parents die? And on May 30th, the search that would later be highlighted in court as evidence of motive. How much money do you inherit if your whole family dies at once? Detective Torres, reviewing Rodriguez's findings alongside her, noted that the search progression showed Nicholas moving from passive research about inheritance to active planning for violence with frightening speed. On June 1, 2022, the laptop's search history showed Nicholas beginning to research methods of staging crimes, starting with general searches like how do police investigate murders and what evidence do forensics look for at crime scenes. Over the next several days, the searches became increasingly specific and tactical. How to make a murder look like a robbery, what do home invasion robbers steal, how to stage a break-in, and how to avoid leaving forensic evidence. The search history showed Nicholas watching YouTube videos about crime scene investigation, reading true crime forums where amateur sleuths discussed how criminals got caught, and visiting websites that detailed police forensic capabilities. He appeared to be studying criminal investigation techniques with the goal of understanding what mistakes to avoid, what evidence to plant, and what alibis would be most believable. On June 5, 2022, the search history documented Nicholas researching firearms, despite having grown up in a household where guns were forbidden, and his parents had been vocal supporters of gun control legislation. And the searches showed him learning about different types of handguns, ammunition, and the relative noise levels of various calibers, apparently trying to identify a weapon that would be effective but not so loud as to immediately alert neighbors. He searched for how to buy a gun without a background check, private gun sales Florida, buying guns at gun shows, and untraceable firearms. The laptop's browser history showed him visiting websites for gun shows in South Florida, researching which shows had the loosest verification requirements, and, on June 8, 2022, mapping directions to a gun show in Fort Lauderdale. Security camera footage from that gun show, later obtained by investigators, showed Nicholas purchasing a 9mm handgun and ammunition from a private seller, paying cash, and providing minimal identification, a transaction that would later demonstrate additional premeditation. Perhaps most damning was the search history from June 10th through June 14th, the final days before the murders, when Nicholas's research became intensely focused on the specific logistics of his plan. The searches showed him studying the layout of his own family home, reviewing architectural plans that his father had filed with the city during a renovation, and apparently identifying which rooms would be most isolated and which escape routes would be most viable. He searched for how long do gunshots sound loud, how much time before neighbors call 911, and average police response time Miami-rich neighborhoods. The laptop contained saved articles about how smart home security systems worked, which brands could be remotely disabled, and critically, how to delete cloud backup data, research that demonstrated his awareness that the security system would need to be neutralized, and his tragic misunderstanding of his father's backup protocols. Carmen Rodriguez's forensic analysis revealed that Nicholas had made 47 distinct searches related to how to stage a home invasion murder or accelerated inheritance distribution in the 3 weeks leading up to June 15, 2022. Each search was time-stamped, often occurring late at night when Nicholas was alone in his apartment, and the pattern showed an obsessive focus on perfecting his plan. The search history from June 13th included queries about how long to establish alibi, what is a solid alibi for murder, and can phone GPS track your location? The last search being particularly ironic, given that Nicholas's own phone would ultimately provide the GPS evidence that destroyed his alibi. On June 14th, the day before the murders, Nicholas had searched for what to do immediately after family member dies, how to act when someone you love is murdered, and most grotesquely, how to cry on command. Searches that demonstrated his awareness that his performance of grief would need to be convincing enough to deflect suspicion. The laptop also contained evidence of Nicholas's financial desperation that provided crucial context for his motive. Rodriguez discovered bank statements showing a checking account that had gone from a balance of over $80,000 in April 2022 to being overdrawn by June, with transactions showing massive gambling losses at offshore online casinos and cash withdrawals that Nicholas's later discovered communications revealed had been used to purchase oxycodone pills. Text message archives recovered from the laptop showed Nicholas being pressured by dealers and bookies for payment on debts totaling over $2 million, with threats escalating from financial consequences to physical violence as the deadline for payment approached. Messages from June 10th showed a dealer named Rico threatening to make an example of Nicholas if he didn't produce $500,000 by June 20th, creating a timeline pressure that appeared to have accelerated Nicholas's murder plan from theoretical research to immediate action. Detective Torres recognized that the laptop evidence, combined with the audio recordings and iPhone data, created a prosecution case that would be virtually impossible to defend against. The search history demonstrated premeditation, the audio proved commission of the crimes, the iPhone GPS and smart home logs destroyed the alibi, and the financial records established motive. But Torres also knew that in cases involving wealthy defendants, even overwhelming evidence could be challenged by expensive defense teams armed with expert witnesses who could create reasonable doubt about digital forensics, chain of custody, or the interpretation of search history. What the investigative team needed was one final piece of evidence that would remove all doubt and demonstrate consciousness of guilt so clearly that no jury could ignore it. They needed to catch Nicholas attempting to flee, to prove that he knew he was guilty and was trying to escape justice. The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. On June 23, 2022, just 8 days after the murders, and while Nicholas was still publicly playing the role of the grieving survivor, Detective Torres received a tip from an alert TSA agent at Miami International Airport who had been briefed on the case. The agent reported that a young man matching Nicholas Davis's description had attempted to board an early morning flight to Mexico City using a passport that appeared potentially fraudulent, carrying a large amount of cash, and exhibiting nervous behavior that triggered secondary screening. Torres immediately dispatched officers to the airport, and within 30 minutes, Nicholas Davis was in custody at a TSA security office, surrounded by luggage that would provide the final pieces of evidence the prosecution needed. The arrest came before Nicholas could board his flight, and the items seized from his possession would shock even investigators who thought they had already seen the full extent of his calculated depravity. In Nicholas's carry-on luggage, officers discovered $500,000 in cash, bundled in stacks of $10,000 and wrapped in plastic as if prepared for long-term concealment. The money represented a significant portion of the liquid assets Nicholas had been able to access from the estate accounts, funds he had withdrawn over the previous 48 hours, using his authority as the sole surviving family member to make necessary expenditures related to funeral arrangements and estate management. Also in the luggage was a passport that forensic document examiners would later determine to be a sophisticated forgery, bearing Nicholas's photograph, but issued under the name Nathan Donovan, with a fabricated birth date that made him 24 years old, rather than 18. The forged passport had been professionally produced, complete with entry and exit stamps from several countries, suggesting that Nicholas had purchased it from a high-level document counterfeiter weeks or months before the murders as part of his contingency planning. Most tellingly, Nicholas's laptop bag contained a printed itinerary showing not just the flight to Mexico City, but connecting flights to Argentina, a country with which the United States had no extradition treaty. The itinerary showed Nicholas had planned to travel from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, then to Cordoba, with a final destination of Bariloche, a resort town in the Patagonian region, popular with wealthy expatriates seeking to disappear. Investigators would later discover that Nicholas had already wired $1.2 million to an Argentine bank account, opened under the Nathan Donovan identity, and had purchased a luxury apartment in Bariloche using a real estate agent who specialized in helping clients establish anonymous residences in South America. The level of planning demonstrated that the flight attempt was not a panicked reaction to the investigation, but part of a premeditated exit strategy that Nicholas had likely developed before the murders, a backup plan in case his staging of the crime scene failed to convince investigators. When Detective Torres confronted Nicholas at the airport, the young man's carefully maintained facade of grief finally cracked. Gone was the trembling, tearful survivor who had given emotional media interviews and accepted public condolences. In his place was a cold, calculating individual who immediately invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer any questions about the cash, the forged passport, or his travel plans. Torres noted the dramatic transformation, the way Nicholas's body language shifted from the hunched, defeated posture he had displayed in earlier interviews to an upright, defiant stance that revealed the arrogance that had always lurked beneath his performance. The detective knew that this arrest, captured on airport security cameras and witnessed by dozens of TSA agents and passengers, would be powerful evidence of consciousness of guilt, demonstrating that Nicholas knew he was responsible for his family's deaths and was attempting to flee the country before justice could be served. The arrest at JFK Airport, Nicholas had driven overnight from Miami to New York, apparently believing that departing from a different city would reduce his chances of being noticed, provided Detective Torres with the final element his case needed. The timing of the flight attempt, just 8 days after the murders, and while Nicholas was ostensibly helping plan his family's funeral, demonstrated a callousness that would resonate powerfully with a jury. The forged passport and the destination of a non-extradition country removed any possibility that Nicholas could claim this was merely a grief-stricken young man seeking to escape painful memories rather than legal consequences. And the $500,000 in cash, when combined with the evidence of the wire transfer to Argentina, showed that Nicholas had been systematically looting his family's estate even as he publicly mourned their deaths, taking money that should have been preserved for estate settlement and using it to fund his escape. In the days following Nicholas Davis's arrest at JFK Airport on June 23, 2022, prosecutor Anthony Stewart assembled his team at the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office to begin building what he knew would be one of the most high-profile murder cases in Florida history. Stewart, a 20-year veteran prosecutor with a reputation for handling complex white-collar crimes and cases involving wealthy defendants, understood that the combination of digital evidence, audio recordings, and the dramatic airport arrest had given him an extraordinarily strong case. But he also knew that the defense would have virtually unlimited resources to challenge every piece of evidence. The lead defense attorney, Robert Kensington, had already filed motions challenging the validity of the search warrants, questioning the chain of custody for the digital evidence, and arguing that the audio recordings should be suppressed because Marshall Davis had never obtained proper consent from family members to record them in their own home. Stewart recognized that he would need to not only present the evidence of Nicholas's guilt, but also anticipate and preemptively refute every technical challenge the defense might raise. The prosecution's strategy centered on telling a complete story that wove together motive, planning, execution, and attempted escape into a narrative so compelling that the jury would have no choice but to convict. Stewart decided to begin with the financial evidence, establishing first why Nicholas had committed these murders before delving into how he had done it and how investigators had caught him. The financial investigation, led by forensic accountant Michelle Chen, had uncovered a detailed portrait of a young man whose privileged lifestyle had spiraled into addiction and desperation, creating the toxic combination of entitlement and financial pressure that had ultimately led to quadruple homicide. Chen's analysis of Nicholas's banking records, credit card statements, and online transaction histories painted a picture of extravagant spending that far exceeded even his generous $100,000 monthly allowance, forcing him to dip into savings and eventually into debt to maintain his lifestyle. The financial records showed that in the 6 months leading up to the murders, Nicholas had spent over $1.8 million on gambling, primarily through offshore online casinos that catered to high-stakes players and offered credit to wealthy clients. Chen's forensic analysis revealed a pattern common to gambling addiction. Initial wins that encouraged increasingly larger bets, followed by mounting losses that Nicholas attempted to recover through even riskier wagers, creating a downward spiral that ultimately left him owing money to the casinos, to bookmakers who had extended him credit, and to loan sharks who charged usurious interest rates. Bank records showed Nicholas had maxed out 3 credit cards with combined limits of $200,000, had taken out a $300,000 personal loan from a private lender at 40% annual interest, and had begun writing checks from an account that his parents monitored, triggering the confrontation that had led to the suspension of his allowance. Equally damning were the records documenting Nicholas's opioid addiction, which had apparently begun with a legitimate prescription for painkillers after a tennis injury, but had escalated into a dependency that consumed thousands of dollars per week. Text message records recovered from Nicholas's phone showed him purchasing oxycodone pills in quantities of 100 to 200 at a time, paying between $40 and $60 per pill, spending as much as $10,000 per week to feed his addiction. The messages revealed that Nicholas was not only using the pills himself, but had been selling some of them to friends at the University of Miami, apparently trying to recoup some of his costs, while also deepening his involvement in a criminal enterprise that would have exposed him to potential drug trafficking charges had his parents not discovered his addiction first. The financial analysis showed that between gambling losses and drug purchases, Nicholas had been burning through approximately $250,000 per month in the months before the murders, nearly triple his allowance and unsustainable even for someone with access to significant family wealth. The prosecution's financial investigation also revealed the specific trigger that had transformed Nicholas's financial problems from a crisis into a motive for murder. On May 24, 2022, Marshall and Helen Davis had met with their financial advisors, their attorney, and Nicholas in a confrontation that bank records and email communications showed had been carefully planned by the parents. During that meeting, Marshall had presented Nicholas with detailed documentation of his gambling losses and drug purchases, confronting him with evidence that he had been lying about his whereabouts, his activities, and his financial situation for months. The parents had offered Nicholas 2 options: voluntarily enter an inpatient treatment facility for addiction and accept a court-appointed conservator to manage his finances until he could demonstrate 6 months of sobriety, or refuse treatment and have his allowance completely terminated while they petitioned the court to restructure his trust fund to prevent any distributions until he turned 30. Email records recovered from Marshall Davis's account showed that Nicholas had initially refused both options, insisting that he had his gambling and drug use under control and that his parents were overreacting to what he characterized as normal young adult behavior. Marshall's response, documented in an email to his attorney, expressed heartbreak at his son's denial and determination to save Nicholas from himself, even if he hates us for it in the short term. The parents had implemented the allowance suspension immediately, cutting off Nicholas's access to monthly funds effective June 1, 2022, while setting a deadline of June 15th for Nicholas to either enter treatment or face the court petition that would restructure his trust fund. The deadline, the same day as the murders, appeared to be more than coincidence. It suggested that Nicholas had known his window for accessing easy money was closing and had decided that inheriting $50 million immediately was preferable to years of supervised sobriety and delayed trust fund access. Forensic accountant Michelle Chen's analysis revealed another crucial element of Nicholas's financial motive, his misunderstanding of how the trust fund and estate inheritance would actually work. The documents showed that Nicholas had apparently believed, based on his crude internet research, that if his parents died, he would immediately receive full control of both his $50 million trust fund and his share of his parents' estimated $800 million estate. What Nicholas had failed to understand, despite his searches about inheritance law, was that trust funds typically have contingency provisions that delay distribution if the beneficiary is under 25, and that estates of this size typically go through years of probate, tax evaluation, and structured distribution overseen by professional trustees. Had Nicholas actually succeeded in getting away with the murders and avoiding prosecution, he likely would have discovered that the trust fund and estate would have been managed by court-appointed administrators who would have been even more restrictive than his parents had been, especially given the suspicious circumstances of the deaths. But this misunderstanding, while it would have ultimately frustrated Nicholas's plans, even if he had escaped justice, also provided crucial evidence of motive for the prosecution. Stewart's team found in Nicholas's laptop a detailed spreadsheet that the defendant had apparently created in early June 2022, calculating how much money he would receive upon inheritance, and how he would use those funds to pay off his debts, purchase property in South America, and maintain the lavish lifestyle he felt entitled to. The spreadsheet showed Nicholas had calculated that after paying off approximately $2.3 million in gambling debts and drug-related loans, he would still have over $47 million from his trust fund alone, not including whatever portion of his parents' estate he would eventually receive. The document included specific plans for purchasing properties in Argentina and Uruguay, investing in cryptocurrencies to hide assets from potential U.S. tax authorities, and even budgeting for plastic surgery to change his appearance if needed. All evidence that Nicholas had been planning not just the murders, but a comprehensive escape and new identity long before June 15th. Detective Torres's investigation into Nicholas's drug connections revealed another dimension of the financial pressure that had motivated the murders. Surveillance photos and text message records showed that in the weeks before the murders, Nicholas had been meeting with increasingly dangerous individuals demanding payment on his debts, including a drug dealer named Ricardo Rico Morales, who had connections to a Mexican cartel that controlled much of the South Florida opioid trade. Intercepted communications between Morales and his associates showed that they had discussed kidnapping Nicholas to pressure his parents for payment, a scenario that would have exposed Nicholas's drug addiction to his family in the most dramatic way possible. Messages from June 10th, 2022, showed Morales giving Nicholas a final deadline of June 20th to produce $500,000, threatening consequences if the money wasn't paid, pressure that appeared to have accelerated Nicholas's timeline for the murders. The prosecution's financial evidence also documented how Nicholas had immediately begun looting his family's estate in the days between the murders and his arrest, using his status as the sole surviving family member to access bank accounts, liquidate investments, and transfer funds in ways that estate trustees would normally have blocked. Records showed that Nicholas had withdrawn $500,000 in cash from various Davis family accounts between June 16th and June 22nd, claiming the money was needed for funeral expenses and estate management costs. He had also initiated wire transfers totaling $1.2 million to the Argentine bank account he had opened under his false identity, transfers that had been flagged by the bank's anti-money laundering systems but had been initially approved because of Nicholas's status as an authorized signer on the accounts and his explanation that the transfers were for international real estate investments on behalf of the estate. Prosecutor Stewart recognized that this financial evidence served multiple purposes in his case. First, it established clear motive, showing that Nicholas was facing a financial crisis that would only worsen as his debts came due, and his parents' intervention prevented him from accessing his allowance or trust fund. Second, it demonstrated premeditation, as the spreadsheet and the pre-positioned Argentine bank account showed Nicholas had been planning his escape long before the murders occurred. Third, it proved consciousness of guilt, as Nicholas's immediate looting of estate accounts and his wire transfers to foreign banks showed that he knew he would need money to flee and that he needed to move quickly before legal controls were placed on the estate. And fourth, it refuted any potential defense argument that Nicholas had acted in a moment of passion or had diminished capacity due to his drug addiction, as the meticulous financial planning demonstrated clear, calculated thinking. The defense team, led by Robert Kensington, attempted to challenge the financial evidence, arguing that a young man in the grip of addiction and facing threats from drug dealers might have been so mentally impaired that he couldn't form the specific intent required for premeditated murder. They brought in addiction specialists who testified that opioid dependency could cause cognitive impairment, poor judgment, and even psychotic episodes that might explain Nicholas's actions. But Prosecutor Stewart countered with the defendant's own internet search history, showing that Nicholas had been researching murder staging techniques and inheritance law with clear logical thinking that demonstrated full cognitive function. The prosecution also presented evidence that Nicholas's drug tests immediately after his arrest showed lower levels of opioids in his system than would be expected for someone in active addiction, suggesting that he had deliberately reduced his drug use in the days before the murders to ensure he would be clear-headed enough to execute his plan. The financial investigation ultimately provided the prosecution with a clear, understandable motive that would resonate with jurors. Nicholas Davis had murdered his family for money, driven by a toxic combination of entitlement, addiction, and desperation. The evidence showed a young man who had grown up with every privilege, who had never been told no, who had never faced real consequences for his actions, and who ultimately decided that his access to wealth was more important than the lives of his parents and sisters. Stewart's team knew that while the digital evidence proved how Nicholas had committed the murders, and the audio recordings proved that he had actually done it, the financial evidence explained why, providing the psychological motivation that would help jurors understand how someone could commit such an unthinkable act. Dr. Sarah Weinstein, a forensic psychologist hired by prosecutor Anthony Stewart to analyze Nicholas Davis's mental state and provide expert testimony about the psychological profile of the defendant, sat in her office in Coral Gables on July 15, 2022, reviewing hundreds of pages of documents that painted a disturbing picture of a young man whose privilege had metastasized into narcissism and whose narcissism had ultimately enabled murder. Dr. Weinstein had spent 25 years studying criminal psychology, working with everyone from serial killers to white-collar fraudsters, but she found Nicholas Davis's case particularly chilling because it represented a type of killer that was becoming increasingly common in her professional experience: the entitled offspring of extreme wealth who viewed other people, even family members, as obstacles to be eliminated, rather than humans deserving of empathy. Her psychological evaluation, based on interviews with Nicholas's friends, teachers, and former therapists, as well as analysis of his social media posts, text messages, and the journal seized from his apartment, revealed a personality that had been shaped by a lifetime of instant gratification and minimal consequences. The documentary evidence showed that Nicholas had exhibited warning signs of narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial tendencies from early adolescence, though his parents' wealth and influence had consistently shielded him from the natural consequences that might have curbed these developing pathologies. School records from Nicholas's time at an elite Miami private academy showed multiple incidents of bullying, academic dishonesty, and intimidation of other students, all of which had been resolved through the intervention of Marshall and Helen Davis, who had made generous donations to the school following each incident. Former classmates, interviewed by investigators, described Nicholas as someone who believed rules didn't apply to him, who reacted with rage when he didn't get his way, and who showed a disturbing lack of empathy when his actions hurt others. One particularly telling incident from Nicholas's sophomore year of high school involved him physically assaulting another student who had beaten him in a tennis tournament, an attack that should have resulted in expulsion, but instead led to the school building a new athletic facility funded by a $2 million Davis family donation. Dr. Weinstein's analysis of Nicholas's journal entries, which he had maintained sporadically from age 15 through the time of the murders, revealed a deeply distorted worldview in which Nicholas saw himself as superior to others and deserving of special treatment because of his family's wealth and status. Entries from 2019, when Nicholas was 15, showed him expressing contempt for poor people who had to work for a living, contrasting them with people like himself who were smart enough to be born into the right family. Later entries documented his growing resentment toward his parents, particularly his father, whom Nicholas viewed as hypocritical for having built his wealth through aggressive business practices while trying to impose restrictions on how Nicholas spent money. A journal entry from April 2022 described Marshall Davis as a control freak who doesn't understand that the money is mine by right, not his to dole out like I'm some kind of charity case. The psychological profile that emerged from Dr. Weinstein's analysis showed that Nicholas had developed what she termed affluenza, a psychological condition in which extreme wealth and privilege had prevented him from developing normal mechanisms of empathy, consequence recognition, and impulse control. His parents, despite their good intentions and ultimate attempts at intervention, had unknowingly reinforced his narcissistic tendencies by repeatedly rescuing him from the consequences of his actions, whether it was paying off debts, smoothing over incidents at school, or providing him with a lifestyle that insulated him from the reality most people faced. The psychologist noted that Marshall and Helen Davis's final attempt to impose boundaries and require treatment had likely triggered what she called a narcissistic rage collapse, a psychological crisis that occurs when narcissists are confronted with limitations to their power or access to resources they view as rightfully theirs. Text message records provided additional evidence of Nicholas's psychology, showing a pattern of manipulation and emotional cruelty that extended far beyond his relationship with his parents. Messages with his girlfriend from early 2022 showed Nicholas gaslighting her, lying about his whereabouts and activities, and using emotional manipulation to maintain control of the relationship, even as he was cheating on her with multiple other partners. Texts with his sisters revealed a disturbing dynamic in which Nicholas alternated between playing the role of protective older brother and bullying them, often in the same conversation, demonstrating an ability to switch between personas that would later serve him well in his performance of grief after the murders. Messages with friends showed Nicholas bragging about his ability to manipulate his parents, describing how he had learned to work them, to get money or permission for activities they had initially forbidden. Perhaps most chilling were the text messages Nicholas had sent in the 24 hours immediately following the murders, when he was still at the crime scene, waiting for his family's bodies to be discovered and processed by police. Messages to friends expressed what appeared to be genuine emotion about his family's deaths, with Nicholas writing about how devastated and destroyed he was, how he couldn't believe this was happening, and how he didn't know how to go on without them. Dr. Weinstein analyzed these messages and concluded that Nicholas's grief was not entirely performative. He likely did feel some form of loss and emotional distress, but that his narcissistic psychology allowed him to compartmentalize his role in causing that loss, perhaps even viewing himself as a victim of circumstances that had forced him to take desperate action. This psychological splitting, the ability to simultaneously recognize that his family was dead while denying his responsibility and agency in their deaths, was characteristic of severe personality disorders and demonstrated the profound psychological damage that had enabled Nicholas to commit such an unthinkable act. The prosecution's psychological case was strengthened by interviews with Nicholas's former therapist, Dr. Robert Chang, who had treated Nicholas for anxiety and depression during his junior year of high school, but had ultimately recommended that Nicholas's parents seek more intensive treatment for what Chang suspected were underlying personality disorders. Dr. Chang's confidential notes, released to prosecutors after Nicholas was charged with murder, documented concerns about Nicholas's grandiose self-image, his inability to accept criticism or limits, and his concerning lack of empathy for others' suffering. The therapist had specifically warned Marshall and Helen Davis in a private meeting in early 2021 that Nicholas was showing signs of antisocial personality development, and that without serious intervention, these traits could manifest in increasingly destructive behaviors. The parents had apparently taken this warning seriously enough to begin researching treatment programs, but Nicholas had refused to continue therapy and had convinced his parents that Chang was overreacting to normal teenage behavior. Social media analysis provided additional insight into Nicholas's psychological state in the months leading up to the murders. His Instagram account, which featured photos of luxury cars, expensive watches, and exotic vacations, projected an image of effortless wealth and success, but closer examination revealed subtle signs of the crisis brewing beneath the surface. Posts from May 2022 showed Nicholas's captions becoming darker and more cryptic, with references to people who hold you back, cutting toxic people out of your life, and doing whatever it takes to get what you deserve. A particularly ominous post from June 10, 2022, just 5 days before the murders, showed a photo of the Miami skyline at night with a caption that read, "Sometimes you have to make hard decisions that other people won't understand. They'll judge you, but they don't know what you're dealing with. I'm about to take control of my life." Dr. Weinstein interpreted this post as Nicholas signaling his intentions, perhaps even seeking validation from his followers for actions he had already decided to take. Prosecutor Stewart recognized that the psychological evidence served a crucial function in his case. It helped explain how someone could murder his entire family, including 2 young sisters, without apparent remorse or hesitation. While the financial evidence established motive and the digital evidence proved commission of the crimes, the psychological profile answered the question that would inevitably be on every juror's mind. How could a human being do something so monstrous? Dr. Weinstein's testimony would provide that answer, explaining that Nicholas's psychological development, shaped by extreme privilege and parental enablement, had created someone who viewed his family members not as people with inherent worth, but as obstacles standing between him and the wealth he believed he deserved. The psychologist's analysis made clear that Nicholas had the capacity to understand right from wrong. He was not legally insane, but that his narcissistic psychology had allowed him to rationalize the murders as necessary actions rather than moral atrocities. The defense attempted to use psychological evidence in their favor, bringing in their own expert witnesses who argued that Nicholas's drug addiction and the psychological trauma of being threatened by drug dealers had created a state of diminished capacity that prevented him from forming the specific intent required for first-degree murder. Defense psychologist Dr. Marcus Reynolds testified that opioid addiction could cause changes in brain chemistry that affected decision-making and impulse control, and that someone in Nicholas's situation might have acted out of desperation and fear rather than cold calculation. But prosecutor Stewart systematically dismantled this defense through cross-examination that highlighted the extensive premeditation shown in Nicholas's search history, the calculated staging of the crime scene, and most tellingly, his immediate execution of an escape plan that required clear-headed, rational thinking. Dr. Weinstein's rebuttal testimony addressed the defense's diminished capacity argument directly, explaining that while Nicholas certainly had addiction issues and was facing pressure from drug dealers, the evidence showed he retained full cognitive function and the ability to plan, execute, and conceal his crimes with sophisticated reasoning. She pointed out that someone in the grip of a drug-induced psychosis or acting under diminished capacity would not have been able to research staging techniques, systematically disable a complex security system, create a detailed alibi, stage a convincing crime scene, perform grief for the cameras, and execute an international escape plan. The level of executive function required for all of these actions, Dr. Weinstein explained, was inconsistent with any claim of diminished capacity, and instead demonstrated a mind working at full capacity in service of evil intentions. The psychological evidence also addressed another aspect of the case that troubled many observers: how Nicholas had been able to kill his younger sisters, who had done nothing to threaten his access to money and who had actually begged for their lives in the audio recordings. Dr. Weinstein explained that narcissistic individuals often view family members as extensions of themselves rather than as separate people with their own rights and value, and that Nicholas likely saw his sisters as potential complications to his plan, witnesses who could undermine his staging of the crime scene or who might inherit portions of the estate that Nicholas wanted for himself. The psychologist noted that the audio recordings showed Nicholas remaining emotionally flat during his sister's pleas, demonstrating the profound empathy deficit characteristic of severe personality disorders. His ability to hear their fear and pain without being moved to mercy revealed a level of psychological damage that went beyond addiction or financial desperation into something darker and more fundamental. The week following Nicholas Davis's arrest at JFK Airport on June 23, 2022, brought intense media scrutiny and public fascination with every detail of his attempted escape, transforming what was already a horrific crime into a sensational story that dominated news cycles across the country. Detective Samuel Torres, working closely with federal agents from the FBI and the U.S. Marshals Service, began the process of backtracking Nicholas's movements from the moment of the murders through his elaborate escape attempt, uncovering a level of planning that demonstrated the murders had been part of a broader scheme rather than an isolated act of violence. The investigation revealed that Nicholas had begun preparing his escape route months before the actual killings, opening bank accounts under false names, purchasing forged documents, and researching countries with favorable extradition policies, all while maintaining the facade of a privileged college student concerned primarily with tennis and social life. The disconnect between Nicholas's public image and his secret preparations created a portrait of a sophisticated sociopath who had compartmentalized his life with disturbing efficiency. The forensic analysis of Nicholas's movements in the 8 days between the murders on June 15th and his arrest on June 23rd revealed a calculated performance that would have impressed method actors for its commitment and consistency. Immediately after the murders, Nicholas had returned to the country club where he had supposedly spent the afternoon, remaining there until approximately 5:15 p.m. to establish his presence and create witnesses who could testify to seeing him at a time when his family was already dead. Security footage from the club showed Nicholas in the cafe, apparently relaxed, and browsing his phone, occasionally making small talk with other club members, giving no indication that he had just committed quadruple homicide. When he finally left the club and drove back to the Davis estate, arriving at approximately 5:45 p.m., security cameras from neighboring properties captured him parking his car, sitting for several minutes as if composing himself, and then approaching the front door with what appeared to be genuine trepidation. The investigation team obtained security footage from multiple sources that captured Nicholas discovering the crime scene, and forensic psychologists later analyzed his performance frame by frame, noting how he had perfectly calibrated his emotional reactions to appear authentic while avoiding the kind of complete breakdown that might have seemed suspicious or prevented him from answering investigators' questions. The footage showed Nicholas entering the house, calling out for his family, and then the moment when he allegedly saw his father's body and collapsed to his knees in apparent shock. His 911 call, made at 6:47 p.m., was a masterpiece of manufactured emotion, with Nicholas's voice breaking as he reported finding his family dead, begging for ambulances even though he must have known his family was beyond help, and providing information to the dispatcher with just enough coherence to seem like someone fighting through trauma to assist first responders. In the days that followed, Nicholas had maintained his performance with remarkable consistency, giving emotional interviews to reporters camped outside the estate, accepting condolences from family friends and business associates, and working with funeral planners to arrange services for his murdered family. But behind this public facade, Nicholas had been systematically executing his escape plan, moving money, finalizing travel arrangements, and preparing to disappear. Bank records showed that on June 16, 2022, less than 24 hours after the murders, Nicholas had visited 3 different bank branches, withdrawing a total of $200,000 in cash using his authority as the sole surviving family member with access to various Davis accounts. He had told bank managers that the money was needed for immediate funeral expenses and estate matters, and none of them had questioned the withdrawals given the tragic circumstances. On June 17th and 18th, Nicholas had made additional withdrawals totaling $300,000, always spreading the transactions across different banks and different accounts to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts that might have frozen the funds. Surveillance footage from these banks showed Nicholas dressed in mourning clothes, often wearing dark sunglasses and carrying tissues, maintaining his grief-stricken persona, even during transactions that were actually part of his escape preparation. Investigators later discovered that Nicholas had also liquidated approximately $400,000 worth of jewelry and watches from his parents' estate during this period, selling items to high-end consignment shops in Miami Beach and Coral Gables, always paying cash and providing fake contact information. The jewelry sales suggested a level of callousness that shocked even hardened investigators. Nicholas had taken his mother's engagement ring, his father's collection of vintage watches, and other items with deep sentimental value, and converted them to anonymous cash that could be used to fund his flight. The wire transfers to Argentina, which Nicholas had initiated on June 19th and 20, demonstrated sophisticated financial planning that suggested he had consulted with professionals who specialized in helping wealthy individuals move money offshore and evade detection. The transfers had been structured in amounts just below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic currency transaction reports, and they had been sent to an account at a private Argentine bank known for its discretion and minimal cooperation with U.S. law enforcement. Nicholas had used his father's business credentials to initiate the transfers, claiming that they were for legitimate international real estate investments, and the Argentine bank had accepted the funds without questioning their source. Only the alert investigation by forensic accountant Michelle Chen had uncovered these transfers before Nicholas could access the funds in Buenos Aires. the investigation into Nicholas's forged passport revealed connections to a sophisticated document counterfeiting operation that had apparently been preparing his false identity for months. Federal agents traced the Nathan Donovan passport to a forger in New York who specialized in creating high-quality fake documents for wealthy clients seeking to establish backup identities. The forger, when confronted with evidence and facing federal charges, admitted that Nicholas had contacted him in March 2022, months before the murders, requesting a complete identity package including passport, driver's license, birth certificate, and Social Security card. The forger had charged Nicholas $50,000 for the package and had delivered it in early May, suggesting that Nicholas had been planning his potential escape before the confrontation with his parents about his drug use and gambling, perhaps as a general contingency in case his criminal activities were ever exposed. Detective Torres's investigation also uncovered the details of Nicholas's travel plans and the network of resources he had assembled to support his life in exile. The apartment in Bariloche, Argentina, which Nicholas had purchased in April 2022 for $380,000, was located in a luxury development popular with European expatriates and wealthy South Americans seeking privacy and discretion. Real estate records showed the property had been purchased through a shell company registered in Panama, with Nicholas using his Nathan Donovan identity to obscure the transaction's connection to his real identity. The apartment came fully furnished and included access to amenities like private security, a golf course, and a marina, suggesting Nicholas had planned to maintain his privileged lifestyle even in exile. Investigators who examined the property after Nicholas's arrest found evidence that someone had been preparing it for occupation, with groceries in the refrigerator, clothes in the closets, and electronic devices already set up and connected to local internet service. The flight itinerary that Nicholas had been attempting to execute when he was arrested at JFK showed the level of detail he had put into his escape plan. Rather than fly directly from Miami to Argentina, which might have drawn attention given the ongoing investigation, Nicholas had planned a multi-leg journey designed to confuse potential pursuers and give him time to assess whether investigators were closing in on him. His tickets showed a first flight from New York to Mexico City, a 12-hour layover during which he apparently planned to dispose of his real passport and any other evidence linking him to Nicholas Davis, then a second flight to Buenos Aires, and finally a regional flight to Bariloche. He had booked accommodations in Mexico City under the Nathan Donovan identity, creating the impression of a legitimate business traveler rather than a fugitive, and had even created a fake LinkedIn profile for Nathan Donovan, claiming to be a cryptocurrency investor scouting opportunities in Latin America. What ultimately led to Nicholas's capture was a combination of investigative diligence and fortunate timing. Detective Torres, understanding that wealthy murder suspects often attempted to flee before arrest warrants could be executed, had immediately placed Nicholas on a watch list with all major airlines, airports, and border crossings as soon as the evidence against him began to solidify. The TSA agent who flagged Nicholas at JFK had been specifically briefed about the case and had recognized him despite his attempts to alter his appearance with a baseball cap and different glasses. The agent had noticed several red flags. Nicholas was flying one way to a foreign country. He was carrying an unusual amount of cash. His passport photo looked subtly different from his actual appearance, suggesting possible forgery, and his behavior was nervous and evasive when asked routine questions about his travel plans. When TSA agents conducted a secondary screening and discovered the $500,000 in cash, they immediately contacted law enforcement, and Detective Torres had been on a conference call with the agents within minutes, confirming that this was indeed the suspect he had been tracking. The decision to arrest Nicholas before he could board the flight, rather than attempting to track him to Argentina and coordinate with international law enforcement, was made based on the risk that once Nicholas left U.S. jurisdiction, he might disappear into a network of wealthy expatriates and criminal facilitators who could help him evade capture indefinitely. The arrest at the airport, while it prevented Nicholas from actually fleeing the country, provided evidence of flight that was almost as valuable as if he had successfully escaped. It demonstrated consciousness of guilt in a way that no amount of circumstantial evidence could match. The items seized from Nicholas's luggage at JFK provided investigators with additional evidence that strengthened the prosecution's case. In addition to the cash and forged passport, agents found a burner phone that Nicholas had apparently purchased specifically for use in Argentina, a laptop that contained files with instructions for establishing a new life under a false identity, and a handwritten note that appeared to be a checklist of tasks needed to complete his escape. The note included items like confirm bank transfer cleared, dispose of U.S. passport, destroy SIM card from old phone, and establish cover story for Nathan Donovan's background, demonstrating the methodical planning that had gone into the escape attempt. Also found in the luggage was a small amount of oxycodone pills, suggesting Nicholas had planned to continue his drug use in exile, and a thumb drive containing encrypted files that digital forensics experts would later decrypt to reveal family photos. Apparently, mementos Nicholas wanted to preserve despite having murdered the family members depicted in them. The psychological implications of Nicholas attempting to flee just 8 days after murdering his family, while simultaneously planning their funeral and accepting public condolences, revealed a level of compartmentalization and deception that horrified investigators and would later disturb jurors. Dr. Sarah Weinstein's analysis of this behavior suggested that Nicholas's narcissistic psychology allowed him to simultaneously perform genuine-seeming grief. He likely did experience some form of emotional distress at the loss of his family, while also rationally executing his escape plan without those emotions interfering with his self-preservation instincts. This ability to hold contradictory emotional states and to perform sincerity while planning deception was characteristic of severe personality disorders and demonstrated why Nicholas had been able to commit the murders in the first place. Prosecutor Anthony Stewart recognized that the arrest at JFK, coming so soon after the murders and involving such clear evidence of flight with substantial financial resources and a false identity, would be one of the most powerful elements of his case. While the digital evidence proved that Nicholas had committed the murders and the audio recordings confirmed his presence at the scene, the escape attempt proved that Nicholas knew he was guilty and was trying to evade justice. The defense would later attempt to argue that Nicholas had been planning to leave the country to escape the pain of his family's deaths and the media attention, not because he was guilty of their murders, but the forged passport, the cash, the wire transfers to a non-extradition country, and the methodical planning that had begun months before the murders made this argument impossible to sustain. The flight attempt was consciousness of guilt in its purest form, and Stewart knew that when the jury heard about Nicholas's arrest at the airport, they would understand that they were looking at someone who knew exactly what he had done and was desperately trying to escape the consequences. In the months following Nicholas Davis's arrest and his arraignment on 4 counts of first-degree murder, prosecutor Anthony Stewart and his team worked with intensity and precision to construct a case that would leave no doubt about the defendant's guilt. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office committed unprecedented resources to the prosecution, assigning a team of 8 attorneys, 5 paralegals, and dozens of support staff to work on various aspects of case preparation. Understanding that the defense would have virtually unlimited resources and that any weakness in the prosecution's case would be ruthlessly exploited. Stewart, working from a war room in the state attorney's office that had been dedicated exclusively to the Davis case, created a prosecution strategy that would present the evidence in a narrative arc designed to build inexorably toward conviction, starting with the financial motive, progressing through the digital evidence of planning and execution, and culminating with the audio recordings and flight attempt that proved guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecution's preparation included detailed witness interviews with over 150 people who had known Nicholas, his family, or had been involved in the investigation, each interview designed to build a comprehensive portrait of the defendant, his victims, and the events leading to the murders. Stewart personally interviewed Emma and Sophie Davis's friends and teachers, gathering heartbreaking testimony about the two young girls whose lives had been stolen by their brother's greed and narcissism. These witnesses described Emma as a passionate environmental activist who had plans to study marine biology and had already been accepted to several prestigious universities, and Sophie as a talented pianist who had performed with youth orchestras and dreamed of becoming a music teacher. The testimony about the victims served a crucial strategic purpose, humanizing the people Nicholas had killed, ensuring the jury would see them as real individuals with hopes, dreams, and futures, rather than as abstract victims in a legal proceeding. The prosecution's digital forensics team, led by Carmen Rodriguez, prepared detailed presentations that would explain the technical evidence to jurors who might have limited understanding of how smart home systems, cloud backups, and GPS data worked. Rodriguez created visual aids, including timelines that synchronized the audio recordings with iPhone GPS data and smart home system logs, demonstrating with minute-by-minute precision that Nicholas had been in the house during the murders and had remotely controlled the security system at the exact moment the killings began. The presentations were designed to make complex technical concepts accessible to average jurors while maintaining the scientific rigor that would withstand challenges from the defense's technical experts. Rodriguez also prepared to testify about the impossibility of the digital evidence having been fabricated or manipulated, anticipating that the defense would try to argue that the recordings had been doctored or that the GPS data was unreliable. Prosecutor Stewart made the strategic decision to organize his case around 5 key themes that would be reinforced throughout the trial: motive, Nicholas's financial desperation and entitlement; means, his knowledge of his father's security system and his access to weapons; opportunity, the murders occurring when no one else was home and Nicholas had canceled his alibi; planning, the extensive search history and preparations demonstrating premeditation; and flight, the escape attempt proving consciousness of guilt. Each phase of the trial would focus on one or more of these themes, with witnesses and evidence carefully selected to build a cumulative case that would overwhelm any doubts the defense might try to create. Stewart knew from experience that jurors responded to clear narrative structure, and he was determined to tell a story that would be both logically compelling and emotionally powerful. The prosecution's preparation also included detailed planning for presenting the audio recordings, which Stewart knew would be the most emotionally devastating but also the most legally sensitive evidence in the case. The recordings captured the Davis family's final moments in horrifying detail, including the sounds of gunshots, screams, and desperate pleas for mercy, all of which would be traumatic for jurors to hear. Stewart consulted with psychologists about the best way to prepare jurors for this evidence, deciding to provide detailed warnings about the content, offer counseling resources for jurors who might be affected, and present the audio in a way that respected the dignity of the victims while still conveying the full horror of what Nicholas had done. The prosecution also prepared transcripts of the audio that would allow jurors to follow along while listening, highlighting key moments when Nicholas's voice could be clearly identified or when his words revealed his motive and intent. The defense team, led by Robert Kensington, working from a suite of offices in a luxury high-rise in downtown Miami, funded by the Davis family estate, pursued a multi-pronged strategy that attempted to create reasonable doubt through technical challenges to the evidence, alternative theories of the crime, and sympathy for Nicholas as a young man struggling with addiction. Kensington hired a team of expert witnesses, including digital forensic specialists, who would testify about potential vulnerabilities in smart home systems that might allow hacking. Audio analysis experts who would claim the voice on the recordings couldn't be definitively identified as Nicholas, and psychologists who would argue that Nicholas's drug addiction and the pressure from drug dealers had created diminished capacity. The defense also prepared to argue that the flight attempt could be explained as a grief-stricken young man trying to escape painful memories rather than an admission of guilt, though even Kensington's team recognized this would be a difficult argument to sustain given the forged passport and cash. Pre-trial motions filed by the defense revealed their strategy of trying to suppress or exclude key evidence that they knew would be devastating to their client. Kensington filed motions to exclude the audio recordings, arguing that Marshall Davis had not obtained consent from all family members to record them in their home, and that the recordings therefore violated Florida's wiretapping laws. The motion argued that even if Marshall had a right to record conversations in his own home, his son had a reasonable expectation of privacy that was violated by the recordings. Prosecutor Stewart opposed this motion vigorously, arguing that the recordings were made in common areas of a home by a property owner with every right to install security systems, and that even if there were technical violations of wiretapping laws, the evidence should be admitted under exceptions for serious crimes. The judge ultimately ruled in the prosecution's favor, finding that the audio recordings were admissible and that their probative value far outweighed any privacy concerns. The defense also filed motions to suppress the evidence obtained from Nicholas's iPhone and laptop, arguing that the search warrants had been overly broad and that investigators had exceeded the scope of their authority in examining his devices. Kensington argued that the warrant had authorized a search for evidence related to the murders specifically, not a general fishing expedition through all of Nicholas's digital life, including his search history and financial records. Stewart countered that the search history was directly relevant to proving premeditation and that the financial records established motive, both of which were clearly within the scope of a murder investigation. The judge again ruled in favor of the prosecution, finding that the searches had been properly authorized and conducted within constitutional bounds, though the judge did exclude some personal communications that had no relevance to the charges. One of the most significant pretrial battles involved the defense's attempt to exclude evidence of Nicholas's escape attempt, arguing that it was unfairly prejudicial and didn't prove guilt of the murders themselves. Kensington argued that wealthy people often maintained offshore accounts and that Nicholas's travel plans could be explained by his desire to escape media attention and public scrutiny rather than by consciousness of guilt. The motion argued that allowing the jury to hear about the forged passport and the cash would inflame their emotions and lead them to convict based on Nicholas's post-murder behavior rather than on evidence that he actually committed the crimes. Stewart's opposition brief argued that flight was one of the oldest and most recognized forms of evidence showing consciousness of guilt, that Nicholas's elaborate escape planning demonstrated knowledge that he would be accused of the murders, and that a defendant's attempts to evade justice were always admissible in criminal trials. The judge ruled that the escape attempt evidence would be admitted, finding that it was highly probative of Nicholas's mental state and his awareness of his own guilt. As the trial date approached, set for November 7, 2022, both legal teams intensified their preparations with mock trials, jury consultants, and exhaustive preparation of every witness who would testify. Prosecutor Stewart personally rehearsed his opening statement dozens of times, refining the narrative to maximize emotional impact while maintaining the professional, fact-based tone that he believed would be most effective with the jury. He knew that the opening statement would be crucial in framing how jurors understood the evidence they would hear over the coming weeks, and he wanted to strike a balance between prosecutorial authority and empathetic advocacy for the victims. The statement he crafted would begin with a description of the Davis family on the morning of June 15, 2022, going about their normal routines with no idea that they had just hours to live, creating an emotional foundation before diving into the evidence of how and why Nicholas had destroyed his own family. The defense's preparation included intensive work with Nicholas himself, trying to transform him from the arrogant, entitled young man who had been arrested into a sympathetic defendant who could potentially evoke jury compassion. Kensington arranged for Nicholas to undergo a physical transformation, cutting his hair in a more conservative style, dressing him in modest suits rather than the luxury brands he preferred, and coaching him on courtroom demeanor. The goal was to present Nicholas as a troubled young man who had made terrible mistakes under the influence of addiction, rather than as the cold-blooded killer that the prosecution would portray. But those who observed Nicholas during pre-trial proceedings noted that his attempts at humility and remorse seemed performative, that the same narcissistic arrogance that had enabled him to commit the murders continued to show through despite his lawyer's coaching. The jury selection process, which began on November 7, 2022, proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the trial, with both sides using all available peremptory challenges and challenges for cause to shape a jury that might be favorable to their case. The prosecution sought jurors who had families of their own and would be able to empathize with the victims, who understood technology well enough to appreciate the digital evidence, and who seemed logical and fact-oriented rather than swayed by emotion or sympathy for defendants. The defense looked for jurors who might be skeptical of law enforcement, sympathetic to addiction issues, or potentially overwhelmed by technical evidence. After 5 days of voir dire examining over 200 potential jurors, a panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates was seated, representing a diverse cross-section of Miami-Dade County residents who would now be responsible for determining Nicholas Davis's fate. The trial of Nicholas Davis began on November 14, 2022, in a packed courtroom in downtown Miami, with media from around the country covering what had already been dubbed the trial of the century by legal commentators fascinated by the intersection of extreme wealth, family annihilation, and cutting-edge digital forensics. Judge Maria Alvarez, a 20-year veteran of the bench known for her strict courtroom management and fairness to both sides, presided over proceedings that would ultimately span 6 weeks and include testimony from over 80 witnesses. The gallery was filled with journalists, legal observers, members of the victim's extended family, and members of the public who had won seats in the daily lottery for courtroom access. Security was intense, with metal detectors, bag searches, and armed deputies stationed throughout the courthouse, reflecting both the high-profile nature of the case and concerns about potential disruptions from the media attention. Prosecutor Anthony Stewart's opening statement, delivered with controlled emotion and prosecutorial precision, painted a devastating portrait of a family destroyed by one member's greed and entitlement. Stewart stood before the jury, making eye contact with each member as he described the Davis family's last morning together. Marshall in his office working on business deals that would have secured his family's future for generations. Helen in the kitchen preparing lunch and thinking about her daughter's upcoming school events. Emma and Sophie in their rooms listening to music and doing homework, all of them completely unaware that they had only hours to live. Stewart's voice grew harder as he described Nicholas's motivation, explaining how the defendant's addiction and gambling had created a financial crisis that he chose to solve not through treatment or accountability, but through murder. The prosecutor methodically outlined the evidence the jury would hear, promising to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Nicholas had planned executed, and attempted to escape responsibility for the systematic slaughter of his own family. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene investigators who described discovering the bodies and processing the horrific scene. Detective Samuel Torres took the stand for 2 days of testimony, walking the jury through the initial investigation, his growing suspicions about Nicholas's timeline and demeanor, and the breakthrough discoveries that had transformed the case from a potential home invasion to a case of family annihilation. Torres described watching Nicholas's media interviews and sensing that something was wrong, that the grief seemed performed rather than genuine, and how his instincts had been confirmed when the digital evidence revealed the truth. Under cross-examination by Robert Kensington, Torres stood firm in his conclusions, calmly refuting defense suggestions that investigators had been biased against Nicholas because of his wealth, or had rushed to judgment without considering alternative suspects. Carmen Rodriguez's testimony about the digital forensics evidence lasted 4 days and proved to be one of the most crucial elements of the prosecution's case. Rodriguez explained to the jury, using detailed visual aids and simplified technical language, how smart home systems work, how cloud backups function, and why it was impossible for the audio recordings to have been fabricated or manipulated. She walked the jury through the process of recovering the encrypted backup files, explaining each technical step in a way that even jurors with no technology background could understand. When Rodriguez played excerpts from the audio recordings for the jury, a decision that required extensive preparation and warnings to the jurors, several jury members were visibly shaken, with some wiping away tears as they heard Helen Davis's final desperate pleas for her daughter's lives. Rodriguez also testified about the iPhone GPS data and smart home system logs, presenting synchronized timelines that proved beyond any doubt that Nicholas had been in the house at the time of the murders and had remotely controlled the security system. The defense's cross-examination of Rodriguez focused on trying to create doubt about the reliability of the technical evidence, with their own expert witnesses testifying that GPS data could be inaccurate, that smart home systems could be hacked, and that audio recordings could potentially be manipulated using sophisticated software. But Prosecutor Stewart's redirect examination systematically dismantled these theories, having Rodriguez explain why each of the defense's alternative explanations was technically impossible given the specific evidence in this case. The prosecution also presented testimony from engineers who had designed the Davis family's smart home system, who explained that the backup protocols Marshall Davis had implemented were specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation the defense was suggesting, and that the encryption and authentication systems made it impossible for the recordings to have been altered after the fact. The financial evidence presented by forensic accountant Michelle Chen consumed 3 days of testimony and provided the jury with a detailed understanding of Nicholas's motive. Chen walked the jury through Nicholas's bank statements, credit card bills, and online transaction histories, painting a picture of a young man spiraling into financial desperation despite having access to wealth that most people could never imagine. She explained the $2 million in gambling debts, the escalating drug purchases, and the pressure from dealers demanding payment, creating a timeline that showed Nicholas's crisis deepening in the exact weeks when his internet searches showed him beginning to plan the murders. Chen's testimony was particularly effective when she explained the spreadsheet Nicholas had created calculating his expected inheritance, showing the jury a document that revealed the cold, calculated nature of his planning, reducing his family's lives to dollar figures on a balance sheet. The testimony of Dr. Sarah Weinstein, the forensic psychologist, helped the jury understand the psychological profile of the defendant and how someone could commit such unthinkable acts against his own family. Dr. Weinstein explained narcissistic personality disorder in language accessible to laypeople, describing how Nicholas's upbringing in extreme wealth and his parents' pattern of rescuing him from consequences had created a personality structure that viewed other people as obstacles or resources rather than as humans deserving of empathy. She testified about the journal entries that revealed Nicholas's contempt for those he viewed as inferior and his rage at his parents for daring to impose limits on his access to money. Under cross-examination, Dr. Weinstein firmly rejected the defense's suggestion that Nicholas had diminished capacity due to his drug addiction, explaining that the extensive planning and sophisticated execution of the murders demonstrated full cognitive function and clear intent. The emotional climax of the trial came when the prosecution played the full audio recordings for the jury, a presentation that lasted nearly 45 minutes and left the courtroom in stunned silence. The jury listened through headphones to avoid subjecting the courtroom gallery to the traumatic content, but their reactions, visible distress, tears, expressions of horror, made clear the impact of hearing the Davis family's final moments. The recordings captured Marshall Davis's confusion turning to realization as his son raised the gun, Helen's desperate maternal instincts trying to protect her daughters even as she was dying, and most heartbreakingly, Emma and Sophie's young voices pleading with their brother to spare them, unable to comprehend why he would want to hurt them. The audio also captured Nicholas's cold, emotionless responses, his refusal to show mercy, and his methodical progression through the house, each element demonstrating the calculated nature of his actions. Perhaps equally powerful was the testimony about Nicholas's behavior after the murders, his performance of grief, and his escape attempt. The prosecution presented security footage from the country club showing Nicholas appearing relaxed and normal just hours after committing quadruple homicide, contrasted with footage from the crime scene showing his theatrical display of shock and grief. Witnesses testified about Nicholas's tearful media interviews, his acceptance of condolences, and his apparent cooperation with investigators, all while he was secretly transferring money offshore and preparing to flee the country. When the prosecution presented evidence of the arrest at JFK Airport, the forged passport, the $500,000 in cash, the ticket to a non-extradition country, several jurors visibly reacted with expressions of disgust, clearly understanding that these were the actions of someone who knew he was guilty and was desperately trying to escape justice. The defense's case, presented over 8 days, attempted to create reasonable doubt through expert testimony, challenging the digital evidence, and through portraying Nicholas as a young man whose judgment had been impaired by addiction and who had been pressured into actions he wouldn't normally have taken. Defense expert witnesses testified about potential vulnerabilities in smart home systems, questioned whether the voice on the recordings could be definitively identified as Nicholas, and suggested that GPS data could be unreliable under certain conditions. But the prosecution's rebuttal witnesses, who had more extensive credentials and experience, systematically refuted each of these claims, explaining why the defense's theories didn't apply to the specific evidence in this case. The defense also called Nicholas's former friends and acquaintances who testified that he had been a good guy who had gotten involved with the wrong people through his drug use. But these character witnesses were undermined on cross-examination when Stewart got them to admit they hadn't seen Nicholas in months and hadn't known about the extent of his gambling and addiction. Robert Kensington's closing argument attempted to humanize Nicholas and create sympathy for him as a troubled young man who had made terrible mistakes, but whose life shouldn't be ended by a murder conviction that would result in life without parole. Kensington argued that Nicholas had been in the grip of addiction, that he had been threatened by dangerous drug dealers, and that while terrible things had happened, the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Nicholas had specifically intended to kill his family with premeditation, rather than acting in some kind of drug-induced state of diminished capacity. The argument felt desperate, even as Kensington delivered it, and the stony expressions on many jurors' faces suggested it was not landing with its intended effect. Kensington's co-counsel, Jennifer Morrison, attempted to create doubt about the digital evidence, arguing that the jury couldn't really be sure the technology was as reliable as the prosecution claimed. But this technical argument seemed to confuse rather than persuade the jury. Prosecutor Stewart's closing argument was a masterpiece of trial advocacy, bringing together all the evidence presented over 6 weeks into a cohesive narrative that left no room for doubt. Stewart walked the jury through the 5 themes he had established in his opening statement: motive, means, opportunity, planning, and flight, showing how each piece of evidence supported these themes and how they all combined to prove Nicholas's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. He played selected excerpts from the audio recordings again, reminding the jury of Helen Davis begging for her daughter's lives and of Nicholas's cold refusal, asking them to imagine their own families facing such horror. Stewart displayed the search history showing Nicholas's 47 queries about staging murders and accelerating inheritance, asking the jury whether these were the searches of someone acting impulsively or of someone carefully planning a massacre. He showed the photo of Nicholas at the airport with the forged passport and cash, asking whether an innocent man who had just lost his family would be trying to flee to a non-extradition country with a fake identity. The prosecutor's final words to the jury were simple and powerful. Nicholas Davis murdered his father for money, his mother for money, and his 2 young sisters for money. And then he tried to escape to Argentina to enjoy the money he had killed for. But he failed, because his father's technology captured his crimes and the dedication of law enforcement brought him to justice. And now we ask you to complete that justice by finding him guilty on all counts and ensuring that he spends the rest of his life in prison for what he did to his family. The courtroom sat in absolute silence as Stewart returned to his seat, the weight of his words hanging in the air, and several jurors were seen nodding slightly, apparently in agreement with the prosecution's case. Judge Alvarez gave the jury their instructions on the law, explaining the elements of first-degree murder and the requirement that they find proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the jury retired to begin deliberations on the afternoon of December 22, 2022. The jury in the Nicholas Davis murder trial deliberated for 11 hours over the course of 2 days, a timeline that legal observers noted was relatively quick given the complexity of the evidence and the severity of the charges. Inside the deliberation room, the jury foreman later revealed, there had been very little disagreement about Nicholas's guilt, with most jurors voting guilty on the first ballot and the remaining deliberation time spent ensuring they had carefully reviewed all the evidence and understood the legal standards they were required to apply. Several jurors would later tell reporters that the audio recordings had been the most powerful evidence, that hearing Nicholas's voice as he methodically killed his family members while they begged for their lives had eliminated any possible doubt about his guilt and his intent. Other jurors emphasized the escape attempt, noting that an innocent person who had just lost his entire family would not have been trying to flee to Argentina with a forged passport and hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. On the morning of December 23, 2022, word spread through the courthouse that the jury had reached a verdict, and within minutes the courtroom was packed with media, legal observers, and members of the victim's extended family who had attended the trial faithfully throughout its duration. Nicholas Davis was brought into the courtroom by armed deputies, his expression carefully neutral, but his hands trembling slightly as he took his seat next to his defense team. Prosecutor Anthony Stewart and his team sat calmly at their table, confident in the strength of their case, but aware that juries could sometimes deliver surprising verdicts, Judge Maria Alvarez entered the courtroom and instructed the jury foreman to announce the verdicts, and the courtroom held its collective breath as the foreman stood and began to read. On count 1, the murder of Marshall Davis, we find the defendant, Nicholas Davis, guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered reactions, with several of Marshall's business associates nodding in satisfaction, and some of Helen's family members beginning to cry. Nicholas's face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened visibly. The foreman continued, "On count 2, the murder of Helen Davis, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation. On count 3, the murder of Emma Davis, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation. On count 4, the murder of Sophie Davis, we find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder with premeditation." By the end of the verdicts, Helen's sister Margaret was sobbing openly, surrounded by family members who held her in support, while Marshall's brother David sat with his head bowed, visibly relieved that justice had been served. Judge Alvarez polled the jury to ensure each member agreed with the verdicts, and all 12 jurors confirmed their agreement. The judge then set a sentencing hearing for March 10, 2023, explaining that she would hear victim impact statements and arguments from both sides before determining Nicholas's sentence. Under Florida law, first-degree murder with premeditation carries a possible sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole, and given that Nicholas had been convicted on 4 counts, he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. As deputies led Nicholas out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he finally showed emotion, his composure cracking as he realized the full weight of what had just happened, though even in that moment his expression seemed more one of self-pity than remorse for his victims. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive and nearly universal in praising the prosecution's case and the jury's decision. Legal commentators marveled at the strength of the digital evidence and how it had eliminated any possibility of Nicholas escaping justice despite his elaborate planning. Technology experts discussed the case as a landmark demonstration of how modern smart home systems could provide evidence that was virtually impossible to refute, and some suggested that the Davis case might deter other would-be criminals who had previously believed they could outsmart law enforcement through careful planning. True crime podcasts dedicated multiple episodes to analyzing the trial, with many focusing on the psychological profile of Nicholas and trying to understand how someone could murder his entire family for money. In the weeks between the verdict and sentencing, Prosecutor Stewart's team prepared for the victim impact portion of the sentencing hearing, working with the Davis family's extended relatives and friends to craft statements that would help Judge Alvarez understand the full human cost of Nicholas's crimes. The prosecution knew that victim impact statements served not just a legal purpose, but also a healing purpose for those left behind, giving them an opportunity to express their grief and loss in a formal setting, where the person responsible for that loss would be forced to listen. Stewart personally met with Helen's sister, Margaret, Marshall's brother, David, and several of the cousins and close friends who wanted to address the court, helping them organize their thoughts while being careful not to script them, understanding that the most powerful impact statements came from the heart rather than from careful legal preparation. The defense team, meanwhile, struggled to develop a mitigation strategy that might convince Judge Alvarez to show some leniency in sentencing, despite the horrific nature of the crimes and the multiple victims. Robert Kensington's team prepared arguments about Nicholas's youth. He had been 18 at the time of the murders, and his struggles with addiction, suggesting that these factors warranted consideration even in light of his conviction. They brought in additional psychologists who testified about brain development in young adults and how the frontal lobe, which controls impulse regulation and long-term planning, continues to develop into the mid-20s. The defense also prepared to argue that consecutive life sentences would be unnecessarily harsh and that concurrent sentences would be more appropriate. Though they recognized these arguments would be difficult to sustain given the premeditated nature of the crimes and the deliberate targeting of 4 separate victims. The sentencing hearing on March 10, 2023, proved to be even more emotionally intense than the verdict, as victim after victim took the stand to describe how Nicholas's crimes had devastated their lives and torn apart their family. Margaret Davis spoke first, describing her sister Helen as the most loving and generous person she had ever known, someone who had dedicated her life to helping children through her charitable work and who had been an extraordinary mother to her own daughters. Margaret's voice broke as she described learning of the murders, the surreal horror of realizing that all 4 family members were gone, and the particular anguish of knowing that Helen's last moments had been spent trying desperately to protect her daughters from their own brother. She spoke directly to Nicholas, asking him how he could have done this, how he could have listened to his mother's pleas and his sister's cries and still pulled the trigger, but Nicholas stared at the defense table and refused to make eye contact. David Davis, Marshall's younger brother, spoke about growing up with Marshall and watching him build his business empire from nothing through intelligence, hard work, and ethical business practices. David described Marshall as someone who had never forgotten where he came from, who had remained humble despite his wealth, and who had been devoted to his family above all else. He spoke about Marshall's joy in his daughters, how proud he had been of Emma's environmental activism and Sophie's musical talent, and how Marshall had been trying to help Nicholas overcome his addiction because he loved his son and wanted him to have a good life. David's statement became more emotional as he described the impact of the murders on the extended Davis family, how holidays would never be the same, how Emma and Sophie's cousins had lost the friends they had grown up with, and how a family that had once been close and loving had been destroyed by one member's greed and narcissism. Emma's best friend, a young woman named Rachel, who had known Emma since elementary school, gave one of the most powerful victim impact statements of the hearing. Rachel described Emma's passion for protecting the environment, her plans to study marine biology and work on ocean conservation, and the bright future that had been stolen from her at age 16. She spoke about the last conversation she had with Emma just days before the murder, when Emma had been excited about an upcoming trip to volunteer at a sea turtle rescue center. Rachel broke down completely as she described learning about Emma's death, the guilt she felt for not somehow preventing it, even though there was nothing she could have done, and the ongoing trauma of knowing how Emma had died, how she had begged her brother for her life and been killed anyway. She looked directly at Nicholas and told him that he hadn't just killed Emma, he had killed all the good she would have done in the world, all the children she would have taught to love the ocean, all the species she might have helped save, and he had no right to take that away. Sophie's piano teacher, Mrs. Elena Ramirez, spoke about Sophie's extraordinary musical talent and her gentle, kind personality. Mrs. Prails Ramirez described Sophie as a student who had practiced devotedly, who had loved music with pure joy rather than for competition or prestige, and who had talked about wanting to teach music to underprivileged children who wouldn't otherwise have access to musical education. She recounted how Sophie had performed at a recital just 2 weeks before her murder, playing Chopin with such feeling that there wasn't a dry eye in the audience, and how Sophie had been preparing for a prestigious competition where she would almost certainly have won a scholarship. Mrs. Ramirez's voice shook with anger as she addressed Nicholas, telling him that he had murdered a child, his own sister who had loved him and trusted him, and that no amount of money could ever justify what he had done. After the victim impact statements concluded, Judge Alvarez asked Nicholas if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Robert Kensington advised his client to express remorse and to ask for the court's mercy, but when Nicholas stood to speak, his words rang hollow and self-focused. He claimed to be truly sorry for what happened to my family, using passive language that avoided taking direct responsibility for his actions. He spoke about his struggles with addiction and claimed that he had been not in his right mind when the murders occurred, despite the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and careful planning. He asked the judge to consider that I was young and made terrible mistakes, and to give me a chance for rehabilitation someday. But his delivery lacked genuine emotion and came across as a rehearsed performance aimed at generating sympathy rather than a sincere expression of remorse. Several jurors who had remained in the courtroom to hear the sentencing visibly shook their heads during Nicholas's statement, clearly not believing his claims of remorse. Prosecutor Anthony Stewart's sentencing argument was forceful and uncompromising, arguing that Nicholas's crimes represented some of the most heinous murders in Florida history and warranted the maximum possible punishment. Stewart walked the judge through the aggravating factors that justified consecutive life sentences without parole: the multiple victims, the betrayal of family relationships, the vulnerability of the child victims, the extreme premeditation demonstrated by weeks of planning, the use of a firearm, and the defendant's complete lack of remorse despite his attempt to perform it during his statement. Stewart argued that Nicholas had shown through his escape attempt and his behavior throughout the trial that he was concerned only with avoiding consequences, not with taking responsibility for what he had done, and that he posed a permanent danger to society if he were ever released. The prosecutor concluded by arguing that the only appropriate sentence was 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, ensuring that Nicholas would spend the rest of his natural life in prison for destroying his family. Judge Alvarez took only a few minutes to render her sentencing decision, indicating that she had carefully considered all the evidence and arguments, but that the appropriate sentence was clear. She described the murders as acts of unspeakable evil committed by someone who valued money more than human life, who was willing to slaughter his own parents and young sisters to satisfy his greed and sense of entitlement. The judge noted that the victim impact statements had made clear the ripple effects of these crimes, how Nicholas's actions had destroyed not just 4 lives, but had devastated an extended family and a community. She referenced the audio recordings, noting that the court has listened to the evidence and heard the victims' final moments, heard them begging for their lives, and heard the defendant's cold refusal to show mercy. And those recordings make unmistakably clear the defendant's intent and his complete lack of empathy. Judge Alvarez sentenced Nicholas Davis to life in prison without possibility of parole on each of the 4 murder counts, with the sentences to run consecutively rather than concurrently, meaning that even if somehow one conviction were overturned on appeal, Nicholas would remain in prison for the rest of his life based on the other convictions. The judge also imposed additional sentences on related charges, including evidence tampering and attempt to flee prosecution, though these were largely symbolic given the life sentences on the murder counts. As she pronounced the sentence, Nicholas showed no visible reaction, staring blankly ahead, as if dissociating from the reality of what was happening. The courtroom gallery erupted in applause as the sentence was announced, with victims' family members embracing and crying tears of relief that justice had finally been served. As deputies led Nicholas Davis out of the courtroom for the final time, he would be transported to a maximum security state prison where he would spend the rest of his life in a small cell, stripped of the privilege and wealth that had defined his existence, with decades to contemplate what he had done. The Davis family's extended relatives gathered outside the courthouse to speak to the media, expressing gratitude to Prosecutor Stewart and Detective Torres for their tireless work on the case, and sharing their hope that the outcome would bring some measure of closure, though they acknowledged that no sentence could truly compensate for the loss of Marshall, Helen, Emma, and Sophie. Margaret Davis spoke for the family, stating that while nothing can bring back our loved ones, knowing that Nicholas will spend the rest of his life in prison provides some small comfort, and we hope this case serves as a warning that no amount of wealth or privilege puts someone above the law or allows them to escape justice for their crimes. In the months following Nicholas Davis's sentencing to 4 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, the case continued to reverberate through legal, technological, and social spheres, prompting discussions about family dynamics in extreme wealth, the role of digital evidence in modern criminal justice, and the failures of a system that had allowed a dangerous individual to escalate to mass murder despite numerous warning signs. Detective Samuel Torres, reflecting on the investigation in an interview with a criminal justice journal, emphasized that the Davis case demonstrated both the power of modern forensic technology and the irreplaceable importance of traditional detective work and instinct. Torres noted that while the digital evidence had ultimately proven Nicholas's guilt beyond any doubt, it was his initial suspicions about the defendant's demeanor and timeline inconsistencies that had focused the investigation in the right direction, reminding law enforcement professionals that technology was a tool to support good detective work, not a replacement for it. Carmen Rodriguez and her digital forensics team received recognition from the International Association of Digital Forensics for their work on the Davis case, which was cited as a landmark example of how smart home technology and cloud computing had created new evidentiary possibilities that would reshape criminal investigations for years to come. Rodriguez gave presentations at law enforcement conferences around the country, explaining the technical methods used to recover and authenticate the Davis family's security system backup files, and she worked with technology companies to develop best practices for preserving digital evidence in ways that would withstand legal challenges. The case prompted many wealthy families to review their own smart home security systems, with some seeing the Davis case as a cautionary tale about the privacy implications of constant recording, while others viewed it as validation of comprehensive security measures that could protect against both external threats and internal dangers. Prosecutor Anthony Stewart, whose handling of the Davis case elevated his already strong reputation, was subsequently promoted to lead the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office's Major Crimes Division, where he would oversee prosecution of the county's most serious cases. In interviews about the Davis prosecution, Stewart emphasized that while the strength of the digital evidence had made conviction likely, the prosecution's strategy of humanizing the victims and presenting a clear narrative had been crucial to ensuring the jury understood not just that Nicholas was guilty, but why his crimes were so heinous as to warrant the maximum possible punishment. Stewart noted that the victim impact statements at sentencing had been particularly powerful, reminding everyone in the courtroom that Marshall, Helen, Emma, and Sophie were not abstract legal concepts, but real people with dreams, relationships, and futures that Nicholas had stolen, and that those statements had clearly influenced Judge Alvarez's decision to impose consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. The Davis case also prompted broader discussions about how the criminal justice system handles cases involving defendants from extreme wealth, with some commentators noting that Nicholas's ability to retain high-powered defense attorneys and expert witnesses demonstrated the advantages that money could buy, even when guilt was overwhelmingly clear. Others argued that the case actually showed that the system worked, that despite Nicholas's resources and his family's wealth, the evidence had been too strong to overcome, and justice had been served. Legal scholars who studied the case noted that the digital evidence had been particularly important in neutralizing any advantage Nicholas might have gained from expensive attorneys, because no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away audio recordings of the murders or GPS data placing him at the scene, demonstrating that technology had created a more level playing field in criminal justice. Mental health professionals and addiction specialists used the Davis case as an opportunity to discuss the relationship between substance abuse, untreated mental illness, and violence, though they were careful to note that the vast majority of people struggling with addiction never commit violent crimes, and that Nicholas's drug use appeared to be a symptom of deeper psychological problems rather than their cause. Dr. Sarah Weinstein, whose psychological analysis had been crucial to the prosecution's case, published an article in a forensic psychology journal examining how Nicholas's narcissistic personality disorder and sense of entitlement had created a psychological framework in which murder seemed like a rational solution to his problems, and she argued that early intervention in cases of developing personality disorders could potentially prevent future tragedies. The article prompted discussions in educational and psychological communities about how to identify and address warning signs of dangerous personality development in privileged youth before those traits escalated to criminal behavior. The case had a profound impact on discussions about family wealth and the responsibilities of parents to impose boundaries and consequences on their children, even when those children were adults. Several parenting experts and family therapists pointed to Marshall and Helen Davis's late-stage intervention as tragically too little, too late, noting that by the time the parents attempted to impose meaningful consequences, Nicholas was already 18 years old with fully formed narcissistic patterns and a sense of entitlement that made him view their intervention as an existential threat rather than an act of love. These experts emphasized that parents of means needed to begin teaching their children about the value of money, the importance of work, and the reality that wealth was a responsibility rather than an entitlement from early childhood, creating psychological frameworks that would prevent the kind of toxic relationship with money that had consumed Nicholas. The extended Davis family used some of the estate's resources to establish the Davis Family Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to supporting causes that had been important to each of the victims: environmental conservation in Emma's memory, music education for underprivileged children in Sophie's memory, technology education and innovation in Marshall's memory, and children's literacy programs in Helen's memory. The Foundation's mission statement explicitly referenced the tragedy that had created it, noting that while Nicholas Davis sought to steal his family's wealth for selfish purposes, their true legacy will be the positive impact their resources can have on the world when used with the generosity and compassion that Marshall, Helen, Emma, and Sophie embodied in their lives. The Foundation's first major project was funding a marine biology scholarship program at the University of Miami for students pursuing ocean conservation careers, fulfilling the dream that Emma had never gotten to realize herself. Detective Torres, in his final report on the Davis case filed with the Miami Police Department, reflected on the lessons learned from the investigation and the importance of following evidence wherever it led, regardless of a suspect's wealth or social position. Torres wrote that the case had reinforced his belief that the best investigators approach every case with open minds and careful attention to detail, that they trust their instincts while also demanding hard evidence to support those instincts, and that they never allow a suspect's apparent grief or respectability to blind them to inconsistencies and red flags. He noted that Nicholas's performance in the immediate aftermath of the murders had been so convincing that less experienced investigators might have accepted his victim narrative without probing deeper, and he encouraged his colleagues to remember that some of the most dangerous criminals were also the most skilled at manipulation and deception. The audio recordings from the Davis case, while never released publicly out of respect for the victims' families, became a training tool used in law enforcement academies and prosecutor training programs to demonstrate both the power of digital evidence and the importance of presenting such evidence in court in a way that was respectful to victims while still conveying the full horror of the crimes. Instructors noted that Prosecutor Stewart's handling of the recordings, providing detailed warnings to the jury, offering transcripts to follow along, and presenting them at the right moment in the trial for maximum impact, had been a model for how to handle traumatic evidence in a professional or effective manner. The recordings also became a cautionary tale in discussions about smart home security, with privacy advocates noting that while the recordings had served justice in this case, they also raised important questions about the extent to which our homes should be under constant surveillance. Nicholas Davis began serving his sentence at Florida State Prison, a maximum security facility where he was housed in protective custody due to concerns about his safety and the general population, where prisoners who had killed children were particularly vulnerable to violence from other inmates. Prison psychologists who evaluated Nicholas in his first months of incarceration reported that he continued to show minimal genuine remorse for his crimes, that his primary emotional state appeared to be self-pity and resentment at having been caught rather than guilt over what he had done to his family, and that he blamed his parents for creating the situation that had led to the murders by cutting off his allowance. These reports confirmed Dr. Weinstein's assessment that Nicholas's narcissistic personality disorder was deeply ingrained and unlikely to respond to treatment, suggesting that even if he someday developed some capacity for genuine remorse, he would remain a dangerous individual whose sense of entitlement would always pose a risk to others. The case file on Nicholas Davis, comprising thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of hours of audio and video recordings, and extensive digital evidence, was archived by the Miami-Dade Police Department and the State Attorney's Office as a comprehensive example of a successful complex murder investigation and prosecution. Legal scholars and criminologists would reference the Davis case for years to come as a demonstration of how traditional detective work and cutting-edge technology could combine to solve even the most carefully planned crimes, and how the criminal justice system could hold accountable even the wealthiest and most privileged defendants when the evidence was strong and prosecutors were willing to pursue justice with determination and skill. The case also served as a grim reminder that family annihilators came from all socioeconomic backgrounds, that wealth and privilege provided no protection against psychological pathology, and that some individuals were willing to commit the most heinous acts imaginable when their sense of entitlement was threatened. In the final analysis, the Nicholas Davis case represented both a triumph of justice and a tragedy of wasted potential. A young man who had been born with every advantage, who could have used his family's wealth and his own intelligence to make positive contributions to the world, had instead chosen to destroy the people who loved him most because he valued money more than human life. The 4 consecutive life sentences without parole that he received on March 10, 2023, ensured that Nicholas would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, stripped of the privilege that had defined his existence, living with the knowledge of what he had done and what he had lost. For the extended Davis family and the community that had been shaken by the murders, the conviction and sentencing provided some measure of closure, though they knew that no legal outcome could truly compensate for the loss of Marshall, Helen, Emma, and Sophie, whose absence would be felt forever by all who had known and loved them.